So today we're going to look at basically two things. One is how libraries developed in West Virginia, in the state of West Virginia. This will be a very quick overview, just to put it in context. And then to look more specifically at the history of the Ohio County Public Library, which started as the Wheeling Public Library. One of the things I discovered in doing this is that there isn't a lot of material here that the library has. So if any of you have pictures at home from the library or artifacts from the library, Friday would be a wonderful day to bring them in and participate in the memories program. And I'm sure that Sean would be very happy to borrow some of this material and scan it and put it in our collection. Most of the photographs that you see in the presentation, if they look grainy, it's because they're copies of copies, and copies of photocopies of copies, and so they're not the best quality. But a lot of them are already on the library's webpage. So let's start with library development in West Virginia. Unlike the Northeast, Vermont, Connecticut, those early colonies, library development was very limited in West Virginia. That sort of makes sense if you think about it. We were a frontier for quite a while. But it began with library companies in the early 1800s. The first literary society we know about was in Romney in 1819. And then various literary societies grew. And often these literary societies had libraries for their members. And often you would read stories about the wonderful resources of the literary societies. Then in the 1830s and 40s, we had lyceums, athenaeums, and literary institutions which developed. And then by the middle of the 1800s, you began to see colleges, normal schools develop, and libraries begin to be a part of those institutions. In the 19th century, in May, the Wheeling Library Association was chartered by the Circuit Court of Ohio County. You can see this is a stock certificate. You would have had to have bought a share in the Library Association to be able to go and use its facilities. This is also on the library's webpage here. And then in October 12, 1982, the Wheeling Library Association becomes the Wheeling Public Library. This is the birthday, generally, of what people call the library here. So. Then in the 1900s, you can see there would have been a lot of library development around the country, but in West Virginia there was not much. There was one public library in the entire state. There was one state law library, a historical library, several colleges and universities had libraries, and around now is when the literary societies begin to disband, the lyceums are not as popular, and membership is dropping off. And often these libraries are merged into other institutions. In 1901, the governor of West Virginia requested legislation for public library system. It was not approved by the legislature. In 1914, 12 cities and towns had public libraries, so we're doing a little bit better. But still, that's the middle of the 20th century, and we still do not have tons of libraries in the state. And the first public library that was funded by county dollars, believe it or not, was in Lewis County in Weston. And there is a library. It's still being used today, and it has an interesting local connection because it's the Bennett homestead. Sally Maxwell Bennett, of course, was a Wheeling native, and we know about the Bennetts, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But that is still in use, much to the chagrin of the library. It's a horrible building for a library. But it was the first county-funded library in the state. Then in June of 1929, West Virginia Library Commission is established by law, but it's not funded. It won't be until the 40s that they get any money to do anything, so that becomes a bit of a problem. So now we're in 1929, we've got 23 public libraries. You would have expected more around this time. In 1932, there was a cataclysmic event that happened. It affected this community greatly. The tax limitation amendment to the state constitution was passed. The state had suffered very much financially through the Depression. And so they were pulling back on taxing and levying. And as a result, the dollars that were there for this library and other libraries disappeared. The levying authority was removed. So in May of '33, the legislature creates the Ohio County Public Library. You've heard a lot of talk lately about special funding laws. This was the first special funding law. They created the library here. Big development around the country with women's clubs. And that was true in this area also. In West Virginia, the Federation of Women's Clubs did a library survey and found that 88% of the state had no access to a library. Now this is in 1938. We're not talking about the 1800s. So library development was very limited in this state. Why? Why is it always the problem? Money. Yes, money. So finally, in 1941, the Library Commission gets funded, limited funding. They set up a headquarters at West Virginia University on their campus behind the president's house. But the big deal for this state was when Eisenhower signed into law the Library Services Bill, because that provided money for construction. And so in the mid-1950s, along with his legacy of interstate highway construction, you remember Eisenhower, we can thank him for providing the construction money for libraries. And finally, on April the 2nd, 1979, every county now had a public library. 79 we're talking about, not 40. 1979. It took that long. And I was in the state at that time, and they didn't want the library. They said, we've got a college right up on top of the hill there. Thank you, we'll use their library. But the director of the West Virginia Library Commission, Fred Glazer, if you've been around, you know Fred was a flamboyant public relations kind of guy, said, we are going to have a public library in every county, and you are the last county. And so they got an instant library, one of the carousel libraries. Still there, still using it. They put another one next to it. So let's look now specifically at Wheeling and the Ohio County Public Library. By the way, that's Virginia Evelyn down in that picture. And Virginia is the one who wrote the first scholarly article on the development of libraries here in Wheeling. So we began to see first in Wheeling subscription libraries. Makes sense, right? We talked about subscription libraries. And so in 1807, we've got a reference in the Wheeling newspaper announcing officers are going to be selected for the Wheeling Library Company. You would have bought stock. There would have been a place, usually a room at this time, and you would have been able to go to the room and read the books, read the periodicals, the newspapers, whatever they were able to put in the collection. In 1811, in Pittsburgh, they mentioned that there's a printing office, a bookstore, and a library. And the quote in the story is the first two quit town for want of public patronage, first two being printing office and bookstore. The last is still upheld by citizens. So the citizens valued their library, at least the ones who were paying for the stock certificate. Then in 1833, we have evidence that the General Assembly of the Commonwealth of Virginia passed an act to incorporate a library company in the town of Wheeling. Again, this would have been a subscription library. Then later in 1834, the Assembly incorporates the Wheeling Lyceum. And so remember we talked about subscription libraries, lyceums, where it's beginning to follow that same pattern that you, and remember at that time, Wheeling was very much interested in cultural activities. Even though we're out here on the frontier, the citizens, there were singing societies, there was a lot of interest in the arts, and the library was part of that. So then the Wheeling Library Association, the subscription library then, was founded in 1859 and chartered later, the Mercantile Association was chartered later in Wheeling. So it absorbed the Lyceum collection that had preceded it, and it provided the very inaugural collection for the Wheeling Public Library, ultimately.